Okay, so can everyone hear me fine? Just want to make sure the volume is okay for everybody. So, hi everybody. My name is Stella Park, and thank you so much for joining me today to talk about gaining consent or assent with children and youth. I'm just gonna get started. So here's a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a history of inclusion of minors in research world and talk about why is it important to include young patients in research and what are some of the challenges associated with pediatric research. And then move on to talk about consent, assent, in research and how are they different and similar in some ways. Talk a little bit about dissent, importance of respecting child's dissent to research participation, and talk about some of the cases where parental consent could be waived. And then conclude with a little bit of a patient engagement in pediatric research. So involving children in medical research studies are not a new concept. Children have been a long-standing, very active members of research community in various research studies over many years. And there has been some, actually many very unfortunate cases where children were involved in research studies in such an unfair, unethical way. So one example of this would be a case of a Willowbrook hepatitis study that happened in 1950s. So the story is that Willowbrook State School was an institution where they provided education and care for mentally challenged children. Dr. Krugman, a medical researcher from New York University School of Medicine, and his team conducted hepatitis study and recruited his study patients from this particular school. So one of the ethical problems with this study was that it did not protect the participants from harm. So new patients who were healthy other than mentally challenged were subjected to the infectious disease. So the researchers would intentionally infect children with hepatitis virus, and their reasoning for that action was that the children would be infected regardless whether they were in the study or not anyway, since the school, I guess, had an outbreak at the time. Another ethical issue was that the recruitment of the patients. So the way the researchers and Dr. Krugman recruited the patients were that they would inform students, parents, that the facility, the school was overcrowded and that their child would only be accepted if they agreed to join the study. So the parents were really left with no option if they wanted to find a place for their kids. So the researcher would receive a consent from the patient, but they did not really fully disclose the whole detail about what's going to happen during the study. So in response to such unethical research conduct, several guidelines were established after that to ensure the safety and rights of a minor participating in research. So in 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki included criteria for minors in research studies. However, with these unfortunate histories around children in research studies, as well as the vulnerability around involving children in research, there has been some level of social stigma when it comes to recruiting children patients in research studies. So, in an attempt to protect them, minors were effectively excluded from research and became what they call therapeutic orphans. So why do we need more research involving children and why is it important? So as I was doing sort of my research on to prepare for today's session, I was really surprised to learn that how there's such a big demand for more research involving children, and there's lack of science and pharmaceutical data to treat these this particular population, and the significance of including children in research as well, and how it could actually work to influence study design of other research in different therapeutic areas. So, so why is it important? So the challenge. importance is that the physiology of children as well as disease progression in children are different from those of adults. So also when it comes to effect of a medication, the pharmacokinetics of many drugs will be different with age of a child. And also there are disorders, certain disorders that can only be understood in the context of a child's growth and development. Research with children may also help understand adult diseases that are thought to have their origin in early life. So research data obtained from young patients could potentially be really helpful in developing preventative interventions. So it's kind of shocking to know that many physicians actually end up prescribing off-label pediatric drugs due to the fact that these drugs just don't have enough formally tested data on children, and that the physicians actually end up more like extrapolating pediatric dosage based on adult data, so even though children are not small adults. So the absence of age-appropriate formulation of drugs and the lack of data on efficacy and toxicity of these drugs may expose our children to serious harm. So for example, Health Canada decided in 2008 that some over-the-counter cough and cold medicine should not be labeled for use in children under age 6. So over-the-counter cough and cold medicine have long history of use in children, but there is a limited evidence to support the efficacy of these products in this particular population. So, and on top of that, had been many reports of misuse, overdose, and rare side effects that raised concern about the use of these medications. So, in children under the age of 6. So that's why you don't see cough medicine for children, for a baby under 6. So what are some of the challenges? So it's first one would be the difficulty in reaching consensus that including children in research is necessary. Given that children are vulnerable population, research should be subject to rigorous government framework, complying with national ethical and professional standards and legislation. Methodological challenges, what they mean by that is that, so a certain childhood form of chronic disease, for example, juvenile chronic arthritis, are uncommon, and this may lead to difficulties in gaining statistical power to detect an effective treatment. Another example would be childhood asthma. So a diagnosis of childhood asthma could be a little bit subjective sometimes, and this could potentially be an issue or a challenge when it comes to establishing a clear inclusion-exclusion criteria for a study protocol design. Another challenge would be the expense of developing new treatments for pharmaceutical companies. It's from their profit point of view, they're targeting somewhat narrow population range, so the market is rather small, so it's not as attractive. There have been some initiatives to encourage clinical research involving pediatric population. For example, in the United States, the USA adopted legislative provisions to increase the number of drug trials involving minors by offering incentives to manufacturers and by publishing requests for proposals to third parties in case of a lack of interest by manufacturers. And European Commission also adopted the legislative provisions to facilitate and harmonize the conduct of pediatric clinical trials. In Canada, two important initiatives were taken place to encourage pediatric research. So the first one was adoption of Health Canada guidance document called Guidance for Industry Clinical Investigation of Medicinal Products in the Pediatric Population. And there was the Food and Drug Regulations that was amended in 2006 to extend the data protection period by 6 months for certain pediatric drugs. So by doing that, extending the terms of data protection in this manner is intended to encourage the submission of pediatric research results to provide health benefits to children and adolescents. So despite some sad historical events, as well as some challenges that are associated with pediatric research, there seems to be a consensus that in national and international level that the inclusion of children in research while offering appropriate protection is much needed practice in the world of clinical research. According to TCPS2, it says that inequity is created when particular groups fail to receive fair benefits of research, or when groups or their data or their biological materials are excluded from research arbitrarily or for reasons unrelated to the research question. So this is a sort of like a summary of a criteria for inclusion of minors in research. So it's widely accepted in majority of ethical regulatory bodies around the world. So it says minors should only be included when the research cannot be carried out on adults. Consent of the parents and assent of the minor, when feasible, are required. Research should involve no more than minimal risk if there's no prospect of a direct benefit to the minor. Um, if it involves more than minimal risk, there should be a prospect of a direct benefits. Research should be approved by REB and satisfy regulatory and legal requirements of the jurisdiction. For some studies, the validation, adult data validation may be required. And certain regulatory bodies, they prefer, they indicate that they prefer the recruitment of older minors. Yeah. So when we plan to recruit children in research studies, we inevitably run into this big question of whether to consent or assent our potential participants. So I'm going to start with the definition. So the consent is defined as voluntary agreement of an adult or a competent child based on adequate knowledge and understanding of relevant information to participate in research. Assent is a child's agreement to participate in the research. So when I read these definitions, I thought my first question was, what would be the meaning of competent child, and how do you measure or assess child competency or capacity to provide informed consent? So to answer my question, I went on to do a little research to review the Canadian law regarding age of consent. So when it comes to providing consent for research study participation, there's no age of a consent in most Canadian provinces except Quebec. So in Quebec, if you're 18 years old and wants to volunteer for a research study, and you may do so without parental consent, as long as you are capable of providing informed consent. When it comes to other medical decision that is not in research setting, you could even make your own decision if you are 14 or older. So in Quebec, in 14, you can seek your medical care, counseling, psychiatric help, whatever it might be. You can do it on your own, with no parent permission. So unlike with age of majority laws for drinking, driving, and smoking, consent for medical treatment tends to be more fluid and situational, and it depends more on the mental and emotional capacity of the individual, not so much on the age part. So you might ask, why is it set up this way? So wouldn't it be easier to have some sort of like set age or some sort of standardized guide to say that this is where you draw the line? So this sort of setup is influenced by the mature minor doctrine, which is used in the context of a medical care, that emphasizes the capacity of individual rather than the age. So some kids are much less mature by the age of 18, 19, or 20, whereas there are kids who are far more mature if they're only 13 and 14. So it's really, everyone is different and every patient is different. Every situation is a somewhat different. So it will be really challenging to have a hard and fast rules about it. So the focus is, again, not so much on the age, but more emphasis on individuals' capability to absorb study information and be able to make informed decision. And researchers believe that this kind of setup would maximize patients' autonomy. So how about our province? So we live in New Brunswick, and I have to say we are set up a little bit different than rest of the province in Canada. So the truth is that in our Medical Act, as of now, there is no specific mention of a consent age for research setting. So there is only the mention of age 16 being able to provide consent for medical decisions. So that's for standard of care medical decision, not the research. Um, so when it comes to providing consent for research study participation in New Brunswick, we follow the age of majority law, which is age 19. So if we review our SOP, which is HRPP SOP number 14 under research involving vulnerable populations, it says parental consent is required for all studies involving children under the age of 19. For studies that involve children between ages of 7 and 18 years of age, assent by the child is to be obtained by the RAB in addition to the parental consent. And if a research study involving children does not require parental consent, strong justification to the RAB must be provided by the researcher and will be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. When it comes to child assent, um, child assent children participants who are aged between 7 and 18 years of age, assent is needed, and who have a capacity to understand the proposed research. Yeah. The form of assent will be determined at the time of approval of the research and will be tailored to the child's level of understanding and be constructed in simple age-appropriate language. So my understanding of this SOP is that for most research studies that involve medical treatment, that involves some sort of a medical intervention, typically parental consent is required on top of child's assent. If your research study is more of observational nature, minimal risk, and it's not really interventional, and it falls more on the under the domain of a social science, and maybe it may be necessary to request parental consent to be waived when you're submitting to ethics, and that will be considered case by cases. So that's my understanding of this SOP. Um, Now that we kind of looked at the legal aspect of the consent and assent, I want to go back a little bit and talk a little bit about the capacity or the competency part of the consent. So what are some of the key questions that you could ask and use to evaluate when you're assessing young patients' capacity to give informed consent? The first thing that I would ask would be the patient's understanding of a current medical condition or certain situation that they're in which allow them to be considered for that particular research project. And then the next question would be, I will ask several questions to confirm the understanding of the study information that you're providing, and then to kind of figure out, do they understand the risks and benefits of it, any prognosis, and do they know that they have the right to accept or refuse the participation? So I think it's important to remember that just because a child said yes, it doesn't mean that he or she is capable of consenting. And also it's interesting to know that I was reading several papers related to this topic, and they were saying that under most circumstances, it tends to be that the capable young patients, they are the ones that who tend to choose to invite their parents in their decision-making process. So it's important to encourage and support involvement of family members during this process, if possible. So I thought that was kind of interesting for me, because I personally thought that this was like kind of interesting, because as I was working as a research coordinator in oncology unit years ago, I often would give, consent study information to older cancer patients, and patients who actually invite actively ask patient family member involvement during consent discussion. Those were the ones that who actually end up signing and joining the study, and then be really competent patient who were like on top of the schedules and requirements and things like that. So that was kind of similar in that way. For those patients who do not who are not capable of providing consent, or for New Brunswickers, if you are between age of 7 and 18, assent is what you would be needing to review and sign before participating in research study. So as I said, assent is minors' willingness to participate in a proposed study. Just like consent, assent of a minor to be obtained before involving them in any sort of a research activity. It's important to note that assent alone is not sufficient to be included in research. There should be a parental consent that comes together with assent. And just like consent process, assent is it should be planned in consideration of age, degree of maturity, developmental stage, and intellectual capacity. Competency of assent should be determined on a case-by-cases, and appropriate tools and methods should be carefully reviewed as part of initial study planning. International and national guidelines says that you do not need to have a written assent form, but if your young patient can read and write, it's much preferred that there is some sort of written form available for them to review and sign and date. According to TCPS2, assent may be expressed verbally or physically, but it's important to note that whatever the process that you have established there, you need to have that clearly documented, and each process needs to have a paper trail, a record of the process. So here's a little bit of sort of like a recommendation of how you can approach your assent process. So for children age 7 or younger, a simple verbal explanation of the study can be given to the patient with reassurances that they do not have to agree if they don't want to. Children between age of 7 and 13, typically informed voluntary assent could be obtained without pressure from parents or investigators. The form may or may not include a signature, depending on the situation. Children aged 14 and 18, assent form should typically be suitable for this age group. It's written in a simple level, and the following should be explained. It should include a study purpose, what procedures will be done, and potential benefits and risks, and invite them to ask questions, and let them know that there is a right to withdraw from the study at any point. Um, and signatures should be required for most cases in this age group. So when it comes to it's kind of like, it's very similar to informed consent, I guess, in a sense that assent is a continuing process, so that it should be renewed as minors' capacity or the nature of the research, any changes that happens along the way. And informed consent should be sought when minor matures. So when they reach the legal age of maturity, you should provide them with a formal consent form, and have them review and sign and agree to continue with the study. When it comes to creating consent forms and assent forms, you typically have two options. So the first one would be having two separate forms. So informed consent form and then assent form separate. Or option two would be you can incorporate assent section in the main consent form. Um, both both options are acceptable for most of regulatory, and TCPS2 allows it, and ICH CCP allows it as well. So here's a link where you can access a couple of really nice Assent templates that I highly recommend. So my CERN is a group that stands for Maternal Infant Child Youth Research Network. It's a federal not-for-profit organization that involves researchers from major academic children's hospitals across Canada. They provide resources and support for pediatric research and clinical trials. So when you have time, I really, really highly recommend that you visit this page, and there's tons of education materials. There's webinars and really interesting articles. I really highly recommend this page. Um, I want to talk a little bit about Dissent. Dissent describes situation when young patient who's not capable of providing consent end up declining assent. And this may be expressed verbally or physically in the form of a crying or resistance. Um, there's no clear established guideline on the dissent of a minor, but it's important that dissent event is documented with some details on it if possible. TCPS2 says expression of a dissent or signs of a suggesting they do not wish to participate must be respected. The overriding of a dissent is possible in some circumstances. So some of the examples cases would be the minor is too young, or there's no reasonable alternative other than what is available in research, and that there are reasonable grounds to believe that it will offer benefit to the patient. Or the minor is suffering from a serious or life-threatening disease and dissent would jeopardize their health. For certain research studies, it may be necessary to exclude parental consent requirement. And some of the examples I can think of would be the research on sexual health or psychosocial research, such as observational research or studies that involving a certain degree of deception where explicit consent or assent may create certain bias. That would be some example of it. When you are considering departure of a consent possibility, it's important for you to review Article 3.7 of TCPS2, where it stipulates 5 main criteria that must be met in order to request waiver of a consent. And this particular, I think this section is actually already embedded in our Romeo ethics application form. So we just kind of briefly review it. So it says that the research involves no more than minimal risk to the participants, and that the lack of consent is unlikely to adversely affect the welfare of the participant. It is impossible or impractical to carry out the research and to answer the research question properly, given the research design if the prior consent of the participant is required. Whenever possible and appropriate after participation or at a later time during the study, participant will be debriefed and provided with additional pertinent information, at which point they will have the opportunity to refuse consent. The research does not involve a therapeutic intervention or other clinical or diagnostic intervention. So those are the points that you need to articulate and explain, provide justification as to why you need to waive the consent, formal consent, I should say. Yeah. And for the last couple of slides, I just wanted to bring out your attention to this really a great sort of movement, a shift of this active patient involvement in health research. So, with easy access to technology and floods of information that's available out there, patients and their families are taking such active role in the world of health research these days. So, and then, increased knowledge and active participation, it really acts more like a catalyst to motivate researchers and clinicians to include voices of patients in order to perform more of a patient-centered research project. So in the old days, I'd say the first 2 columns of where it says learn and participate would be probably the extent of the patient engagement level. But nowadays, we're definitely moving towards this era where patients are really in a driver's seat, where they're really navigating, driving, becoming they're leading their way for the cure of their disease or condition, and really the key players that they are collaborating with research teams and clinicians. So, physicians they share expertise in disease pathways and medication. They have all the expert knowledge, but patients also have expert knowledge on their personal experience and subjective opinions and their experiences of illness that they have a lot to offer as a patient. Um, so I think the extending this sort of mutual collaboration between researcher and patient is especially important when it comes to pediatric research. So the input of pediatric patients and their families is especially important when it comes to drug development and future trial design. So as I was preparing for this session, I come across so many interesting articles, journal papers that sort of relates to this sort of topic. And I thought I would just put out some of the links and some of the names that I come across that if you're interested, you can look up and see. Maybe some of you probably already know about this, but here's the link that I looked at that I thought was really interesting. And that's all I have for today.